It was a cold that didn't just bite, it gnawed right down to the bone. The kind of -20-degree night where the air itself feels frozen solid and sound travels for miles across the snow-packed silence. Elias knew this cold. He'd felt it in the mountains of Afghanistan years ago, a chill that had settled into his shattered knee and never really left. He lived alone now, in a small cabin tucked away in the Colorado Rockies. He liked the quiet. He liked that the only battles he fought these days were with his own memories and the aching stiffness in his leg. But that night, the silence was broken. It started as a whimpering sound, barely audible over the howling wind picking up outside. Elias was sitting by his wood stove, nursing a mug of black coffee, trying to ignore the throbbing in his bad knee. He thought it was a coyote at first, or maybe the wind playing tricks on an old soldier's ears. Then came the scratching, frantic, desperate, right against his front door. Elias didn't get visitors, not ever, especially not during a blizzard that had already dumped 2 feet of snow in as many hours. He grabbed his cane, the walnut wood worn smooth by years of use, and hauled himself up. The pain flared white-hot, but he pushed through it. He limped to the heavy oak door, his hand hovering over the deadbolt. Something told him not to open it. His training, ingrained over decades, screamed at him to stay secure. You don't open the perimeter in a storm. But the scratching turned into a high-pitched yelp that tugged at something deep inside him. A sound of pure, terrifying vulnerability. Elias threw the bolt and cracked the door open an inch. The wind slammed against it, trying to rip it from his grasp, blasting the cabin with ice crystals. He looked down, and his heart just stopped. There were 2 of them, huddled together on his porch mat, already half buried in the drifting snow. The bigger one looked like a German shepherd mix, its black and tan coat matted with ice. It was curled around the smaller one, trying desperately to shield it with its own body. The smaller dog was a scruffy terrier thing shaking so violently its teeth were audible chattering. Its eyes were wide, terrified pools of liquid brown, staring up at Elias with a plea that required no words. They were freezing to death right on his doorstep. Elias didn't think. He just acted. He swung the door open wide, bracing himself against the gale. "Get in here!" he roared over the wind. "Move!" The shepherd looked at him, hesitated for a split second, assessing the threat. Then, realizing this gruff man was their only chance, it nudged the smaller terrier forward. They tumbled inside, a tangle of frozen fur and shivering limbs. Elias slammed the door shut, leaning his weight against it to latch the deadbolt, cutting off the roar of the storm. The sudden silence in the cabin was deafening. The 3 of them just stood there for a moment. An old, broken man and 2 half-dead dogs staring at each other in the flickering firelight. Elias had no idea that by opening that door, he hadn't just let 2 stray animals in out of the cold. He had just invited a miracle into his life. And the truth of why they were there, why they had chosen his cabin out of miles of wilderness, that truth would arrive the next morning with flashing lights and drawn guns. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you believe that animals have a sense we don't understand, hit that like button. And don't forget to subscribe, because what happens next is going to absolutely shock you. Elias wasn't a dog person. He wasn't really a people person either. He valued order, quiet, and being left alone. Now, his cabin smelled like wet fur and desperation. The dogs didn't move from the entryway rug. A puddle of melting snow was forming around them. They were both skinny, ribs showing through their coats. They looked exhausted, but their eyes were sharply alert, darting around the cabin, taking in every shadow. "All right," Elias grumbled, limping toward the kitchen. "Let's get you something besides ice to eat." He didn't have dog food. He opened a can of beef stew, rinsed off the heavy gravy, and put the meat into 2 plastic bowls. He set them down near the fire. The little terrier dove in immediately, practically inhaling the food. But the shepherd didn't eat. It stood up, its legs trembling from the cold, and positioned itself between the food and the front door. It watched Elias. It watched the windows. "It's okay, buddy," Elias said, his voice softer now. He crouched down, ignoring the protest in his knee. "Eat. You're safe." The shepherd looked at Elias, held his gaze for a long, intense moment. Elias felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. That dog's eyes, they weren't the eyes of a dumb animal. They held an intelligence, a depth of awareness that was almost unsettling. It was the look of a sentry on duty. Finally, satisfied that Elias wasn't a threat, the shepherd took a few bites, but after every mouthful, its head snapped up, ears swiveling toward the door, listening to the storm outside. Elias grabbed some old towels. He approached slowly. "Gotta get you dried off, or you'll catch pneumonia in here." He started with the little terrier. It flinched at his touch, then melted into the towel, letting him rub the ice from its scruffy beard. It licked his hand, a tiny, rough gesture of gratitude that made Elias's throat tighten. When he moved to the shepherd, the dog went rigid. It didn't growl, but a low rumble vibrated in its chest. It wasn't aggression. It was a warning. "Be careful." Elias stopped. He respected boundaries. "Okay, on your own terms, big man." He tossed the towel over the dog's back and let it be. As the night deepened, the storm got worse. The cabin groaned under the wind. Snow was piling up against the windows, sealing them into a white tomb. Elias threw 2 more heavy logs on the fire. He settled into his armchair, his cane resting against his leg. He usually read military history books in the evening, but tonight he couldn't focus. He just watched the dogs. They had moved closer to the fire. The little terrier was curled up tight, finally asleep, twitching as it dreamed. But the shepherd wouldn't settle. It paced, back and forth in front of the fireplace. 4 steps one way, turn. 4 steps back, its claws clicking softly on the wooden floor. Every few minutes it would stop and stare at the front door. Its hackles, the fur along its spine, would rise just a fraction. "What is it?" Elias whispered. "It's just the wind. Nobody's out there tonight." He was trying to convince himself as much as the dog, because the way that Shepherd was acting, it was triggering Elias's PTSD. It reminded him of being on point in the Corango Valley, the feeling of being watched, the skin-prickling sense that something was just beyond the wire, waiting in the dark. Elias tried to sleep in his chair. He dozed off in fits and starts, his dreams filled with snow and shadows. Around 2 a.m., he woke with a start. The cabin was pitch black. The power line must have snapped somewhere down the mountain. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the walls. The shepherd was growling. Not a low rumble this time. A deep, menacing snarl that came from the belly. The dog was standing right at the front door, its nose pressed to the crack at the bottom, inhaling sharply. The little terrier was awake too, pressed against the shepherd's back, whimpering. Elias grabbed his cane and his flashlight. He clicked the beam on, sweeping the room. "What do you hear?" Elias demanded, his heart hammering against his ribs. He moved toward the door, reaching for the shotgun he kept mounted above the mantel. As soon as Elias moved toward the door, the shepherd did something incredible. It spun around, abandoned its post at the door, and ran straight at Elias. It didn't attack him. It slammed its heavy body into his legs, nearly knocking him over. "Hey! Back off!" Elias shouted, stumbling. The dog barked, a sharp, commanding bark, and grabbed the cuff of Elias's jeans in its teeth. It tugged hard, pulling him away from the door, away from the front of the cabin, dragging him toward the back bedroom. Elias was confused. Was the threat inside? He tried to pull away, but the dog was relentless. It was 100 pounds of muscle, and it was panicked. It kept pulling, snarling, looking back at Elias with desperate eyes. "Move! We have to move! Now!" Elias knew that look. He'd seen it on his squad leader's face right before an IED went off. It was the look of imminent disaster. He stopped fighting the dog. He let it lead him. He limped quickly toward the back of the cabin into his small bedroom. The shepherd pushed him all the way into the corner of the room, furthest from the living area. The little terrier scrambled in right behind them and hid under the bed. The shepherd stood in the bedroom doorway, blocking Elias inside, facing the living room. It lowered its head and let out a roar that shook the floorboards. And then it happened. The sound started as a crack, like a gunshot high above the cabin. Then a groaning, tearing noise that sounded like the mountain itself was splitting apart. Elias knew that sound. It was a massive ponderosa pine, weighted down by tons of ice and snow, finally giving up its fight against gravity. He barely had time to cover his head. The world exploded. With a deafening crash that shattered the night, the massive tree sliced through the roof of the cabin like it was made of paper. Glass shattered. Wood splintered. Snow and debris blasted into the living room. The impact shook the ground so hard Elias was thrown against the wall. The roar of the wind rushed into the breached cabin. Then silence, except for the settling of debris. Elias was choking on dust and snow. He clicked his flashlight on, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The beam cut through the haze. His living room was gone. The massive trunk of the pine tree lay right across the center of the room. It had crushed his armchair, the chair he had been sleeping in just moments before, into kindling. If the shepherd hadn't dragged him out of that room, Elias would have been flattened instantly. He shone the light toward the bedroom doorway. The shepherd was still there. It was covered in drywall dust and snow, panting heavily, but it was standing, unharmed. It looked back at Elias. Its job was done. Elias crawled out of the corner. He sat on the edge of his bed, looking at the devastation, then at the dog. Tears mixed with the dust on his face. He reached out a shaking hand. The shepherd came to him slowly and rested its heavy head on his good knee. Elias buried his face in the thick fur of its neck and just held on. They stayed like that for the rest of the night, huddled in the back bedroom, while the blizzard raged through the destroyed front of the cabin. The two dogs kept him warm. They kept him sane. When the first gray light of dawn finally broke, the storm had passed. The silence returned, heavier than before. Elias was trapped. The snow and debris blocked the way out. He had no power, no heat, and half a roof. Around 8 a.m. he heard the faint sound of engines struggling up his long driveway. Then voices. "Hello? Is anyone in there? State police." Elias banged on the bedroom wall with his cane. "In here. I'm trapped in the back." It took them an hour to chainsaw through the fallen tree and dig a path to the bedroom window. When the first state trooper managed to pry the window open, he had his service weapon drawn. He looked tense, on edge. He saw Elias sitting on the bed, wrapped in blankets with two dogs flanking him like gargoyles. "Sir, are you hurt?" the trooper asked, his eyes darting to the dogs. "I'm fine," Elias croaked. "Thanks to them." The trooper holstered his weapon and climbed inside, followed by another officer. They looked around at the destruction, eyes wide. "Mother of Nature," the second officer breathed. "You're the luckiest man alive, buddy. That tree should have killed you." "It almost did," Elias said quietly, stroking the shepherd's head. "This one pulled me out of the chair right before it hit." The troopers exchanged a look, a strange, loaded look. "Sir?" the first trooper said, taking off his hat. "We weren't just coming up here to check on you after the storm. We were following tracks." Elias frowned. Tracks. What tracks? These dogs' tracks, the trooper said. Elias was confused. You came all this way for strays. The trooper shook his head slowly. They aren't strays, sir. He pulled a laminated flyer out of his jacket pocket and held it up. It was a missing persons poster. A photo of a 12-year-old girl with a bright smile. Below her picture were two smaller photos. One of a large German Shepherd mix. One of a scruffy terrier. Their names are Brutus and Buster, the trooper said, his voice thick with emotion. They belong to Lily Harper. She was kidnapped 3 days ago from her backyard down in Boulder. Elias felt the blood drain from his face. He looked down at the dogs, Brutus and Buster. The kidnapper, the trooper continued. He brought her up here, to a derelict cabin about 5 miles east of you. We think he was planning to hide out. The trooper took a deep breath. We raided that cabin at dawn this morning. We found the girl. She's alive. She's safe. Elias let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. Thank God. But here's the thing, the trooper said, stepping closer. The kidnapper, a guy named Russo, he confessed everything. He said the dogs were in the backyard when he took the girl. He couldn't shake them. They chased his truck for miles. The trooper pointed to Brutus, the big Shepherd mix. Russo said he stopped the truck about 10 miles down the mountain to deal with the dogs. He threw them out into the blizzard. Figured they'd freeze in an hour. He said this one here, he nodded at Brutus, fought him like a demon. Nearly took his arm off before he managed to kick him out. Elias looked at Brutus. The dog was leaning against his leg, solid as a rock. We found their tracks this morning near Russo's truck, the trooper said. But we almost lost them in the fresh snow. We were about to turn back, assume they died. The trooper paused, his eyes shining. But then we heard the crash. We heard that tree come down on your cabin from miles away. If that tree hadn't fallen, if we hadn't come to check on the noise, we never would have followed their tracks this far up. The realization hit Elias hard. The dogs hadn't just saved him from the tree. By saving him, they had created the noise that brought the police to their location, confirming the general area where the kidnapper was hiding. And, sir, the second officer piped up, looking uncomfortable. When we found Russo's cabin, he had fresh scratches on his face, and there were footprints around your cabin window outside, before the tree fell. Elias stared at the officer. We think Russo tried to break in here last night, the officer said. Probably saw your smoke, wanted a warmer place to hide out. We think the dogs heard him. We think that's why they were growling. Elias looked at Brutus. The pacing, the staring at the door, the deep snarls. The dog knew. He knew the monster who took his girl was right outside. But when the tree started to crack, when the immediate danger shifted from the man outside to the crushing weight above, Brutus made a choice. He couldn't get outside to fight the man. So he saved the man inside. Elias started to cry. Silent, racking sobs that shook his scarred body, he buried his face in Brutus's neck again. The police ended up taking Elias down the mountain in their 4x4. He sat in the back, Brutus on one side, Buster on the other. He refused to be separated from them. At the station, it was chaos, reporters, family members, police everywhere. But the reunion was the only thing that mattered. When Lily Harper's parents walked in, their faces pale with exhaustion and relief, Brutus and Buster went berserk. They leaped over desks, scrambling across the linoleum floor, crying and barking. The parents fell to their knees, burying their faces in the dog's wet fur. It was a pile of tears and licks and shaking laughter. Elias watched from a chair in the corner, his cane across his lap. He felt invisible again, and for the first time in a long time, he was okay with that. He had done his duty. He had held the line. Lily's father stood up and looked around the room, his eyes wild until they landed on the old man in the corner in the dirty Carhartt jacket. He walked over, pulled Elias out of his chair, and hugged him so hard Elias thought his ribs might crack for real this time. "Thank you," the father sobbed into Elias's shoulder. "Thank you for opening your door. Thank you for saving them." Elias patted the man's back awkwardly. "Didn't do much," he mumbled. "They did all the work, I just gave 'em a warm floor." Elias's cabin was destroyed. He couldn't go back. The Harper family wouldn't hear of him staying in a motel. They had a guest cottage behind their house in Boulder. It was small, quiet, and level, easy on the knees. They insisted he stay there as long as he wanted, rent-free, while he figured things out. Elias accepted. Not for the free rent, but because the guest cottage had a big glass door that looked right out onto the Harpers' backyard. Every morning, Elias sits in his new armchair with his coffee. He watches Lily play in the yard, and he watches Brutus and Buster. They aren't freezing anymore. Their coats are shiny and thick. But some things don't change. Whenever Lily is outside, Brutus is never more than 5 feet away from her. He doesn't chase squirrels. He doesn't nap in the sun. He stands guard. His intense, intelligent eyes scanning the perimeter, always watching. And sometimes, when the wind picks up, he looks toward the guest cottage and catches Elias's eye. And the old soldier and the warrior dog exchange a look of shared understanding between two souls who know what it means to protect the innocent in the dark. They know that sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms. Sometimes they just need someone to open the door.